everyone, you're listening to the TechFest podcast. I'm Raga and we're back with a brand new episode about diabetes for all our science lovers and curious brains. And this time our guest is Brendan Gabriel. Hi Brendan.
Hi Raga, I'm Brendan Gabriel. I'm a principal investigator at the University of Aberdeen. So I've been working at the University of Aberdeen for about a year. And before that, I was at the Karolinska Institute in Sweden. But I did my PhD at Aberdeen. So I'm returning to Aberdeen after a 5-year hiatus, with brief stints at the University of Copenhagen and Edinburgh on my travels. So my research looks at exercise physiology and skeletal muscle.
Okay, so the first question for you is, can you explain the key differences between type 1 and type 2 diabetes in terms of type 1 not producing any insulin to type 2 producing insulin but the cell not being able to use it properly?
So I think, I'm fascinated in diabetes. It was originally sort of coined as a term, I think, years ago. Diabetes mellitus is sort of means in Greek, sweet urine. So that was initially how doctors diagnosed diabetes mellitus, which is pretty disgusting, by sort of tasting urine. But that is a symptom that the body has too much sugar that over and above what it can deal with, basically sugar or glucose in the blood. And what we now know that in modern science and medicine, we know that the body is either producing or ingesting or has too much sugar to deal with. And that can happen in a variety of ways. And I think we have these two classes of diabetes, but recent sort of medical evidence shows that it's almost more like a spectrum of different diseases. And there's sort of various groups that people fall into, but you can still broadly classify it into two types of diabetes mellitus, which is, as you mentioned, type 1, which is generally where there's an autoimmune cause in which beta cells in the pancreas, which produce insulin, are destroyed or depleted or don't function properly and don't produce enough insulin or sufficient insulin by which the body can regulate blood sugar properly. Type 2 diabetes also often has that, but it's less influenced compared to type 1 diabetes by this sort of autoimmune response, and has symptoms and causes by which peripheral tissues, so by that I mean tissues like adipose tissue, muscle, skeletal muscle, which I'm interested in, don't respond to insulin as well. They don't take up blood sugar when needed, and that can cause or is often observed in conjunction with depleted ability of the pancreas to produce insulin as well. So both diseases often have this symptom or this sign of the pancreas not being able to produce enough insulin. And type 2 diabetes normally also has the manifestation by which peripheral tissues don't take up enough glucose or don't respond well enough to insulin. So that's the sort of two broad groups of diabetes.
One of your main projects was to use data generated from animals that have been bred to be fat or lean over generations. How did you manipulate that data to find an interlink?
Yes, sure. So I think it's a really interesting and exciting project, and I have to give credit to Professor Nick Morton at the University of Edinburgh, who sort of has really driven the initial stages of this project. I've come on board at a much later stage when some of the cool identification work had already been started. So Nick Morton had this model of where he'd bred mice over several generations to be either fat or thin. Normally in mouse models, there would be a manipulation of genes, or they'd be selected and just have one model to look at sort of whether mice were fat or lean and what the causes of that were. But the cool thing about this model, because the mice have been bred over many generations, it was a sort of polygenic model. And what we mean by that, there were many genes contributing to these observed phenomena and this sort of genetic risk of developing the mice being fat or lean. And that's sort of more, that has more similarities to human populations, where again, people have increased risk for developing certain diseases such as obesity, and that is a polygenic risk normally. So if there is a genetic predisposition, it's nearly always caused by many genes rather than one single gene. So that has that similarity with this mouse model. So it has more sort of relevance to human disease, one might say. So Nick had previously looked at this mouse model and identified a particular gene in the fat tissue, in the adipose tissue of these mice, which had increased the risk of these mice being fat in the absence of them eating more. So eating more is often a high something that it really increases the risk, or is highly causative of obesity in humans. But these mice actually in this model don't eat more, so it's more of a metabolic change. And that's, so Nick had already identified this gene in adipose tissue. He then followed that up to show that it had relevance in humans. And what was really cool about this model is they also appear to have changes in the metabolism in the skeletal muscle, which, as I said, I'm really interested in. And as I said previously, just to recap, muscle is really important because it takes up the majority of blood sugar after a meal, and it also takes up a lot of fat or lipids as well. So if there's a disturbance in the metabolism of skeletal muscle, that can be really bad for diseases such as obesity or type 2 diabetes. So in these mice, we think we have identified a particular gene which is turned on to a greater extent in mice which were more fatter, basically. And in addition to being turned on more, it also had a change in the genetic code close to that gene, which normally indicates that it's actually a genetic change rather than there can be other types of more moderate changes to the way genes are turned on or off. But we think it's actually a change in the genetic code, the DNA of these mice, that is leading this gene to be turned on more. And we have some very initial evidence that this might actually be causative and be changing the metabolism of these muscles, which might predispose these mice to be more fat. And we're trying to follow that up to see if it has relevance in humans, and to see whether there's a sort of mechanism we can identify to determine how this is working and whether this is relevant in human disease. And eventually we could potentially look at people who may have this particular type of genetic change and look at whether there's particular types of treatment that they would benefit from. So this is far down the line, but eventually we might get to the stage where we could test people for this gene and recommend a certain specific type of treatment intervention.
Is obesity only linked to diabetes or any other diseases? If so, how?
Yeah, so firstly, I think something important to note on that is that a lot of the associations we see with obesity are just that, they're associations. So we can't prove that obesity necessarily causes these diseases. So a lot of the data we have on this is from what we call epidemiological studies, which are population-wide data, where we see associations in the data with these diseases. So there is a lot of supporting evidence that in other types of models, in short-term human studies, in animal models, and in cell models as well, that the phenomena associated with obesity and some of the sort of what we would consider the negative metabolic effects within obesity are causative of these diseases. But we can't say for sure, but we do know that it's associated with an increased risk of, as you mentioned, type 2 diabetes. Also, cardiovascular disease is associated with obesity, and also cancer is associated with an increased risk of prevalence in people with obesity. But it's another noteworthy point is that not all groups of people with obesity are associated with a highly increased risk of some of these diseases. So there appear to be certain groups of people living with obesity that, we think either through their environment or their lifestyle or, some other factor that we haven't identified yet, and potentially inherited traits seem to not have a much increased risk of these diseases, developing these diseases compared to their sort of lean counterparts. So there are, variations, and there's as many sort of different traits as there are humans, and I think that's important to note, that it looks like not everyone with obesity is highly at risk of developing these diseases.
Is insulin a hormone or an enzyme or both?
So I think insulin is generally defined as a hormone. So it's actually the anniversary of the discovery of insulin and what it did. So
today.
It's pretty well, not today, but this year. This year is the centenary.
Sorry.
So no, it's okay. Yeah. And I guess there probably wasn't a single day, because I don't think modern science it doesn't often have a kind of eureka moment where there's a single day where people discover things. So I think it was shown over the course of it. So the credit is given for the discovery of insulin to 4 men called Banting, Best, Collip, and MacLeod, and that was they were working in the University of Toronto. But MacLeod was actually an Aberdonian, and he studied at Aberdeen before he went to Toronto, and then he came back to the University of Aberdeen after the discovery of insulin. So that's pretty cool that an alumni of Aberdeen, contributed and led the work in the discovery of insulin. And before that, particularly people with type 1 diabetes, they had very bad, outlooks, because there was no way of controlling their blood sugar. They couldn't produce insulin themselves. No one really knew what the precise hormone was that was responsible for controlling blood sugar. So those people, to be frank, wouldn't survive long. But after the discovery of insulin, it was still quite a hard process to produce insulin. But I think that discovery contributed to saving many lives and actually improving the lives of many people with diabetes. So, incredibly profound discovery from that group of researchers, and that's led to our ability to actually produce insulin at a sort of a much higher capacity and scale. So that the production of insulin from manipulating bacterial cultures has led to the sort of mass production of insulin, which I think certainly most people with diabetes would say was fundamental in their treatment.
How does Metamorphin work in terms of helping insulin work better?
I think it's normally produced metformin. If I like the pronunciation.
Okay.
No, I like Metamorphin. Sounds like turning you to a superhero or something. So metformin is one of these really interesting kind of drugs that it's been prescribed in some countries since the 1950s. So it's very old. And I think, what's really interesting about it is that we don't fully understand how it works in the body. We just know that is really beneficial for diseases like type 2 diabetes. And we know certain things that it does. So it, reduces, so the liver is really important in regulating blood sugar, mainly because it produces a lot of sugar and releases a lot of sugar into the blood. And one important thing that metformin does is it regulates the liver's production of sugar, of glucose. And by slowing that process down and reducing that gives the body time to deal with the sugar that's already in the blood in people with diabetes. So that's a really important thing. It also appears to increase the amount of sugar that skeletal muscle can take up. So I mentioned earlier that skeletal muscle is one of the main kind of stores of glucose after people eat. So metformin appears to slightly increase the uptake of glucose into skeletal muscle and by that again help to regulate blood sugar. But there are quite a few other things that it does, and it affects, to be frank, again, quite a lot of systems in the body. So another sort of recent area of research, or fairly recent, is the gut. And metformin appears to change the way the gut absorbs food and releases glucose. It changes the composition of bacteria in the gut, which again, changes the way we deal and handle with food. It also changes the way that adipose tissue, fat tissue, deals with fat. So it often appears to encourage fat tissue to actually store fat rather than releasing it into the blood. So it just has almost endless array of effects on the body. And I think that makes it absolutely fascinating. It's a very potent beneficial regulator of blood glucose, and it's prescribed widely to people with type 2 diabetes, and again I think is pretty crucial in control of the disease.
Why is Metamorphin given to only certain age groups?
So yeah, this is where my expertise, I think, would run out. I'm not a medical doctor, so in terms of prescriptions and who to prescribe that to, I wouldn't be that confident. I've seen metformin prescribed to even in children in some countries, and I think to people up to the age of 80. I think in people over the age of 80, it has there might be some issues with kidney function, which might kidneys are important in how we deal with drugs and pharmaceuticals. So there might be some issues there, but yeah, I wouldn't be entirely confident in giving my expert opinion on that topic. So yeah, you'd have to ask a medical doctor on that.
Why is Metamorphin in specific used for people who are overweight?
Yeah, so again, so being overweight, as we were talking about earlier, so overweight is a broad term, but I think often people who are overweight and have excess adipose tissue, that can be associated with impaired metabolism and the impaired ability to store lipids and fats and sugars, and if that happens over a prolonged period of time, that can eventually lead to the body not being able to store and deal with glucose as well, which is what we generally call insulin resistance, and that's being overweight and obese is associated with increased prevalence of insulin resistance. So that's generally the issue, or what we think the issue is there. I think the scientific consensus would be that fat tissue or adipose tissue is adapted to store fat. As the name, the sort of slang name we give for adipose tissue is fat tissue, and that suggests that it is adapted to store fat or lipids. However, when that sort of storage capacity is exceeded, and that often happens in people who are overweight, or particularly in people with obesity, then those lipids can often be stored in places which aren't as well adapted to it. So places like the liver, places like muscle, and that can lead to negative metabolic outcomes. So that fat can impair the body's ability to sort of sense insulin, but also to take up glucose. Metformin can help with, as we discussed, how insulin works and how these tissues take up sugar. So if that is observed in someone who's overweight or someone with obesity, then metformin might be able to help ameliorate some of these negative effects.
If you could invent something to cure diabetes, what would it be?
That's a great question. It's tough to answer. I think, I guess, what do we mean by a cure? It's kind of hard to answer that question sometimes. The optimist in me would say that, the treatment and management of type 2 diabetes has improved drastically over the years. And I think that people living with type 2 diabetes now have much better outcomes and outlooks than they did in years gone by. And that's thanks to people, working on research in the treatments and management. I think also looking at the prevention is quite important. So, generally we observe that the prevalence of type 2 diabetes is increasing, and most people think that's predominantly to do with our environment and our interactions with nutrition and our interactions with physical activity and daily our daily lives, basically. And I think so, potentially we would have to look at, or we should be looking, and many people are looking at the environments that we interact with, the infrastructure that we interact with in terms of physical activity. I'm quite interested in that. So looking at driving, how people getting to work, and the sort of infrastructure that we interact with, and our diet, our nutrition, our interaction with foods. I think both of those are quite important things to look at a sort of population-wide scale for the prevention. But one aspect of technology that I'm really interested in is sort of wearable technology. So I'm just starting to move into that research space, and I think there's a lot of promise there to have some kind of system that could sort of meet that criteria of that question, which is if we can develop wearable technology to a point where we can give people day to day, hour by hour information on how they're interacting with their environment. I think we might get to a point where we can encourage people to change their behavior and their interactions with our environment to a point where we could potentially, increase our ability to prevent the development of type 2 diabetes, and also to help the management of type 2 diabetes. And there's been some really cool research, recently that, people with type 2 diabetes can actually go into remission. So, they can actually effectively get rid of the disease. And that doesn't happen that commonly, but it can happen with drastic change to people's lifestyle. So I think if we could enhance and improve technology to get to a point where we can sort of get people to interact with their environments in a different way, we could potentially see more of those cases of remission of type 2 diabetes.
Thank you so much for being on this episode.
Thanks, Raga. It was an absolute pleasure to speak to you.
And guys, that brings us to the end of this episode. Bye.